Hi, and welcome to the Climate Economics Podcast with me, your host, Arvid Viana. And today we're going to talk about air pollution in the United States. Now, air pollution in the US has fallen dramatically over the past half century. But a harder question remains. Are we regulating it efficiently today at the margin? In other words, when we push pollution one step lower, do the added health and welfare benefits outweigh the added costs to firms and the economy? Or have we reached a point where extra cleanup is no longer worth it? This episode revisits that question through one of the most clever data settings in environmental economics, the Clean Air Act offset markets, where firms buying the right to expand emissions in certain areas must pay other firms to reduce them. And those transactions reveal real world marginal cleanup costs, market by market and year by year, allowing a direct comparison to leading estimates of marginal damages. And the headline finding from the research Reed co-authored with Joe Shapiro is that in most markets, marginal benefits still far exceed marginal costs, implying regulation is often too lenient on the margin. However, there are notable exceptions like Houston. Now, this is the second episode covering this paper, because the previous one with Joe Shapiro, we already dived into this topic. However, this conversation is different in its focus, because with Reed Walker, we go deeper into the economic intuition of revealed preference cost measurement, why cost curves can still look surprisingly low even after decades of cleanup, and why certain places, especially Houston, break the pattern. We also broaden out beyond his one paper. Reed explains how cleaner air can shape outcomes decades later, drawing on his research linking Clean Air Act driven improvements around birth to higher adult earnings. So, my guest today is Reed Walker, professor of economics and public policy at UC Berkeley, and faculty co-director of the Opportunity Labs Climate and Environment Initiative. And Reed's work sits right at the intersection of environmental regulation, health, and economic opportunity. With that, let's dive in. So Reed, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I am very excited to talk about air pollution because it's one of my favorite topics, and I think it doesn't quite get enough attention anymore. So this is the follow-up conversation that I had with Joe. So for those who did not listen to the episode with Joe or who can't quite remember, could you just give us a quick summary of your paper and what you found in terms of results?
Sure. So Joe Shapiro and I have a recent paper in the American Economic Review. We're specifically interested in regulation and the efficiency of regulation in the United States. And when we think about efficiency from an economic perspective, we're interested in understanding whether or not the cost of the regulation on the margin, so the incremental cost of an additional unit of regulation, are equal or are larger or smaller than the benefits of that same unit of pollution reduction to society. And so I think quite naturally, one could imagine a situation where we had a regulation that cost $1 billion a ton to reduce air pollution. And if the social benefits of that same unit of reduction were $100 a ton, we might say that's not really worth it from a social perspective. It's way too costly relative to the benefits. So we're really interested in trying to understand on the margin, is it the case that these benefits, the social benefits of better air, are equal to the cost, the private and social cost of regulating air pollution? And that's a hard question to know and to answer because costs are unobserved and benefits are hard to measure as well. So we explore a specific program in the United States under the Clean Air Act, which requires firms that want to locate in specific areas to purchase the permanent rights to emit pollution in these areas. And these purchases are useful because they allow us to get closer to understanding what the costs are of compliance. And the basic idea here stems from the intuition that many have developed in thinking about cap and trade markets or other types of regulatory instruments that tell us a lot about marginal abatement cost. Because the prices of these transactions can, by revealed preference, tell us something about how these firms are thinking about the cost of compliance. And the basic logic is that if the market price for these pollution rights are very, very expensive, let's say $1 billion a ton, then that firm that wants to locate in this region is going to find other technologies or means to reduce their own pollution so that they don't have to buy these expensive pollution rights. Now, at some point, that investment in the firm's abatement might become too expensive. If we think of cost on the margin as increasing for a firm, then at that point, if they still want to locate in that area, they're going to have to buy the remaining amount of pollution that they haven't abated on the open market. And so that's going to tell us on the margin what's the marginal incremental cost for a specific firm. And then similarly on the supply side of things, if you think about where do these permits originate and come from, they come from incumbent firms. And if an incumbent firm in a location sees that the market price is $1 billion a ton, and they can abate their own pollution for $100 a ton, they might say, well, you know what, I can make some money here. I can permanently reduce my pollution emissions, go to the regulator and say, look what I did, certify those pollution emissions as permanent reductions, and then sell them on the open market for $1 billion a ton and make a healthy profit. And so these supply and demand forces take these prices to reveal something about cost on the margin. And we try to use that information in a very simple way and connect it to our best guess or best estimates or what the leading frontier in the literature would tell us are the benefits of pollution reductions on the margin for specific pollutants. Now, the last thing I'll say is that this is studying not global pollutants like greenhouse gas emissions, but they're studying local pollutants, which is primarily what the Clean Air Act regulates. And for local pollution, what are known as criteria pollutants, these have damages or social cost or externalities that are fairly localized in nature. And what that means is that when we emit a ton of, say, PM into the atmosphere, the damages are going to be dispersed because of atmospheric science and wind and other things, but they're going to be fairly local. And what that means is that the damages can be very heterogeneous depending on where we emit the pollution. If we emit a ton of pollution in New York City, it's going to have much higher social cost due to the density of all the people that live in New York, compared to if we emit a ton of PM pollution in the middle of, say, the Nevada desert where fewer people live. And so our notion of efficiency for criteria air pollutants is going to be a local notion, which is to say that, well, in places where the damages are very, very high, we should have much more stringent regulation because the social costs on the margin are very high. And so these offset programs that exist in many different cities all over the United States allow us to see abatement costs on the margin that are different from, say, in LA versus Houston versus New York. And we can compare them to the leading estimates of the marginal benefits of air pollution reduction. So that's the paper in a nutshell and what we're trying to do.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I really like that explanation. And, the title of your paper is Air Pollution Too Lenient? So could you just maybe talk about what you find in terms of results? So you compare the marginal cost to the marginal benefits. Before I want to dive into each one of those, but before, could you just give an overview of the general findings of what you found?
Yeah, so big picture, and for this is like I had a very diffuse prior going into this study um, because air pollution in the United States has improved dramatically over the past 50 years. I mean, we've seen something like 90% improvements in ambient air quality relative to 1970 levels. And so, if you think about abatement costs as being increasing in the amount of abatement that occurs, you know, I kind of wondered going into this study whether or not the cost on the margin were extraordinarily high relative to the benefits. Because is that 98%, that 97 to 98% reduction kind of quote unquote worth it? But what we find is kind of the opposite, where the marginal cost is identified in these offset markets, the marginal abatement cost of the regulation is almost 10 times lower than our leading estimates of the marginal social benefits across markets. Now, that's an average. The cool thing about this study, at least from my perspective, is that we can look at different markets in particular and ask whether or not it looks like, for example, some markets tend to be overregulated or underregulated. And what do we mean by that? We mean by our notion of overregulation is where the marginal abatement cost for specific firms is way higher than the marginal benefit of that same unit of pollution reduction to society. And underregulated would be like, well, the benefits are enormous relative to the cost. So for the vast majority of markets, we see that the regulation seems to be too lenient, meaning that we could further ratchet down these regulations, kind of march up the marginal abatement cost curve to get equality between marginal abatement cost and marginal benefits of the same unit of pollution reduction. But there are some markets, Houston in particular, where it looks like on the margin, the cost of compliance are higher than the marginal social benefits. And there's some unique reasons for that, at least that we've been able to rationalize or speculate about. And those reasons have to do with both cost and benefits.
Yeah, I want to get back to Houston because I think it's a very interesting example. But like you say, overall, you find that the marginal benefits of reducing air pollution are still substantially higher than the marginal cost of abatement. You said you had a kind of diffuse prior going in when you were kind of presenting your results to academics or even, I don't know, policymakers, people in industry. Were they surprised by these results? Because I think Joe too didn't have a good prior. Like, what was kind of the reaction to these results? Because if I read your paper, I'm like, wow, this is actually a strong result that even though I had assumed air pollution has improved so much, there's still these very strong benefits of further reduction.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people found it interesting. I don't know that I had any very strong reactions after presenting the paper, except that it's nice that we now have at least some proxy or estimate of our ability to think about what costs are on the margin, because and that we can estimate these in different locations or at different points in time. Because if you look in the literature, it's very hard to point to a specific paper that has, for one, a marginal cost of abatement on the margin for criteria pollutants. And if it does, maybe it's for a specific industry in a specific location. But the ability to look at different markets and at different points in time and think about what a cost are, I think is we need more of work like this, I think. And the last thing I'll say is that I think it just it raised lots of questions for me too, subsequent questions about long run abatement cost curves versus short run abatement cost curves, and how can it be that we're at 90% reductions in pollution and yet still looks like abatement on the margin is not all that high? And the answer has to be something about technological change, induced innovation, or other ways that we can squeeze out further emissions reductions at lower cost. But that's an area that there hasn't been a lot of compelling research from my perspective, but I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Because in the paper, you also you mentioned the engineering estimates that have been used. Because like you say, you're the first one to kind of get to these marginal costs. Was there like a noticeable difference versus the engineering estimates that you found?
Yeah, although I don't know. I mean, when we did, so that there is, as you mentioned, engineering estimates out there for these compliance costs that the EPA has developed internally. We played around with those and we looked at the software and the inputs into those calculations and talked to people at the EPA that use these tools and have developed these tools, and ultimately kind of came away quite dissatisfied with the quality of the estimates and the inputs being used. And if you ask the EPA officials directly, they are also quite unhappy with their ability to estimate these costs and update these databases. It's an incredibly complex task
Yeah.
where information is scarce and resources are incredibly scarce. And they're basically trying to come up with cost for a specific facility to install a specific technology. And that's really hard because all facilities are kind of different. And it's kind of hard to know, well, what would be the process of having to install this technology? Would there be additional re-engineering cost as
Yeah.
well that we can't observe? Every factory is a little bit different. So, anyways, it's an incredibly hard information burden, and there's like two people at the EPA working on this to try to
Yeah.
quantify engineering cost for every single facility in the United States, and it's just not actually practically feasible.
Yeah. Then maybe we can then also come back to Houston because you mentioned Houston as like the opposite example. So generally, on average, marginal benefits are higher, but Houston is kind of a unique case. Could you just expand on that example to what's going on there? Because
Yeah. So, I mean, things have changed even recently, but 5 to 7 years ago, there, or even a little bit further back, well, I'll talk about the benefits and the cost of regulation in Houston. So, Houston is a non attainment area. And one thing that I didn't mention is that in non attainment areas, areas that are out of compliance with the Clean Air Act, there's a hard cap on stationary source emissions of these pollutants. And what that means is that like there can be no net increase in emissions if a new facility wanted to locate there. They need to find some willing counterparty in Houston to offset or reduce the emissions so that this new facility that's locating there doesn't lead to a net increase
yeah,
in emissions in Houston because Houston's out of compliance. Okay. So Houston is also a place where there's a bunch of petrochemical industry and refining capacity. And it's also the closest area to the kind of West Texas shale boom that's able to refine and process some of the natural gas and oil from the Permian Basin in Texas. So, with the advent of hydraulic fracturing or fracking in the United States and the West Texas shale being a particularly productive basin, demand for expanded refining capacity skyrocketed in Houston underneath a fixed cap of emissions because they were out of compliance with the Clean Air Act. So that means that when you have a huge increase in demand under a fixed cap and a fairly inelastic supply of offsets, then prices are going to spike dramatically. And you see that in the data. When prices spike, well, then people on the supply side might get interested,
yeah,
saying, well, maybe I can make some money by supplying these offsets. And you kind of see prices fall a little bit in the market that speculatively we could tie to supply responses, but I think could be more done there to look at. But prices spike. At the same time, the benefits um, from Houston are a little bit unusual as well, because if we think about the predominant and prevailing wind in the United States, it kind of is like from west to east.
yeah,
And a lot of what's east of the United States is the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, if you want to call it that. And no one lives there. And so those damages are somewhat lower, even though Houston's a major city in the United States. A lot of what gets emitted in Houston gets blown out into the ocean. And so this is a situation where the costs are high because of expanded demand due to hydraulic fracking and petrochemical industry. And the benefits, comparatively for a large major city, are somewhat smaller because a lot of the emissions tend to blow east. And so it's the case in Houston where it does look like that on the margin, at least over some parts of our sample period,
yeah.
cost of compliance are a little bit higher than the benefits.
And is this? Was this like a combination? Because you said it's kind of one of the few cases. Do you foresee it also for other regions coming up in the future? I kind of got the sense it was a unique set of factors, because there's maybe a higher sample period since then, or do you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I think that anytime you have, so I think it's possible in other locations. And I think it's a combination of maybe three factors um, that maybe we could distill into two. But one is like you need a big expansion in demand.
Yeah. Mhm.
And two, you need to have fairly inelastic supply. The inelastic supply of offsets and permits, like people that are willing to show up and reduce emissions permanently, I think is also related to how long an area has been in non attainment. So, if an area has been in non attainment for decades, a lot of the low hanging supply or low hanging fruit has already been kind of picked.
Yeah.
And, but, if an area just like falls into non attainment this year or next year, there's probably a lot of low hanging fruit and low cost abatement options around for people to certify and get paid for
Yeah.
to participate in this program. So I think you could imagine this scenario showing up in other locations to the extent that there are large increases in demand under a
Yeah.
fixed cap with fairly limited supply
Yeah.
available.
Awesome. Then that's transition to talk about the benefit side of things. So
Sure.
we've covered some like the costs, the engineering estimates, Houston. So could you then maybe expand upon like the way you estimated the benefits of the benefits of air pollution reduction?
Sure. Yeah. So Joe and I did something quite deliberate here, which is to say we're not going to estimate this stuff ourselves because estimating the benefits of air pollution reductions, which is something that Joe and I have done in the past in other
Exactly.
settings, is pretty difficult, very context dependent, and in some cases can be controversial. And so, what we did in this setting is to say that we're not going to try to innovate in that space at the moment. We're going to try to take what's at the frontier and take off the shelf estimates from the frontier and compare them to our estimates of the cost of compliance. And when I say the frontier, what I'm pointing to is integrated assessment models that people have developed, uh, most notably Nick Mueller and his collaborators. The AP3 model, which is a model, an integrated assessment model that tries to think about how do we estimate benefits of air pollution reductions or cost of air pollution increases at specific points in time. And the reason it's called an integrated assessment model is because it combines lots of different inputs, some that are um, related to economics, some that's related to atmospheric science, and then squishes them all together and tries to monetize them. And so the basic idea is that it's a model with kind of source receptor matrices of like if I were to emit a ton of pollution from a smokestack that's 300 meters tall or 100 meters tall in LA, we know something about the wind and where that's going to go. And so eventually that's going to land in some area, which we can try to model, and this model does. And then we can kind of take our best guess or the latest estimates of dose or concentration response functions to map those changes in these different areas into measures of population health, morbidity, or mortality. And then we can take our kind of best estimates of, say, the value of statistical life to try to monetize these costs in terms of kind of rolling all of this like emissions impacts into a monetized version of damages. So it's a lot. And but the cool thing I think about this technology is that it's kind of portable. You can download it off the shelf, and then you can think about a lot of different simulations or counterfactuals where like I emit a ton of, say, PM in Seattle, what are the cost of that on the margin when we try to monetize these damages? And the monetized damages, the model is kind of flexible. You can say, I want just mortality estimates. I want mortality and morbidity. I want to incorporate other damages potentially related to, say, like, well, you name it, actually. Could be crop yields or whatever other types of external or social costs that we see or that the literature has estimated, in theory, could be wrapped into this particular model to kind of monetize and quantify the social cost.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Um, that was very helpful. Maybe then this is also a bridge then. So like you've used the AP3 model, which is kind of this integrated assessment model combining a lot of these different pieces um, from economics, from epidemiology. But you've also worked on specifically what the impacts are of air pollution. And I think maybe that's a bridge then to talk about your journal. So then maybe that's a bridge to talk about another paper you wrote in which you like try to get to a part of this puzzle of like what the impacts are of air pollution. And that paper is published in the Journal of Political Economy in 2017, and its title is Every Breath You Take, Every Dollar You'll Make, the Long-Term Consequences of the Clean Air Act of 1970. So again, we're staying in the Clean Air Act, but in this paper, you really looked at what are the long-run impacts of air pollution. So could you then maybe give us an overview of what you tried to do in that paper?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a paper that quite honestly started in graduate school with some fellow graduate students, where we were interested in this emerging literature that came out of epidemiology and then kind of had been picked up by some economists that speculates, studies, tries to quantify a specific hypothesis known as the fetal origins hypothesis. And this idea comes from epidemiology, and there's been a lot of kind of anecdotal, some observational, and some even kind of quasi-experimental evidence to suggest that impacts for in utero, I'm going to take a step back and rewind, but this is a hypothesis that comes from epidemiology that effectively hypothesizes that fetal environment can be particularly important and or predictive for long-run well-being. And this is something that you see even to this day people speculate or talk about. Most notably, I think, in the United States, RFK Jr. is interested in the relationship between, for example, Tylenol taken during pregnancy and autism rates. And that's mechanistically a similar idea to this notion that in utero environment is particularly important and potentially predictive of later life well-being and long-run outcomes. The genesis of some of these hypotheses comes from early studies of, for example, a large Dutch famine, I believe 1800s or so, where there was a lot of malnutrition observed in the population, in particular in terms of pregnant mothers. And when we look at the cohorts of those children that were born in the midst of that famine and how they look 30, 40 years later in terms of measures of IQ or other observable predictors, they look different. And so there's been a lot of subsequent work kind of trying to understand, is that an anomaly? Are there other reasons that might exist?
Yeah.
And so it was something that we were interested in exploring in the context of air pollution for the very reason that there had been some work to suggest that air pollution affects infant health. So, for example, kind of foundational studies in economics on the Clean Air Act, looking at infant mortality by Kin Shea and Michael Greenstone in the early 2000s, and others to suggest that there's some mortality and morbidity effects of in utero exposure to air pollution on infant health. So that's the first building block. At the second build, and so then we were saying, okay, well, if there is this kind of fetal origins literature and there's some emerging evidence to suggest that these critical periods are important for later life outcomes, like what if we just kind of take that Che and Greenstone style paper and research design and try to connect it to data of those same cohorts 30 or 40 years later and ask just, do those kids look different 30 to 40 years later? The ones that were exposed to, say, cleaner air relative to dirty air in the context of the Clean Air Act, do they look different on average? And I think the key that allowed us to make progress in this space is just the discovery of some data that allowed us to do this at large population scales. Most notably, that was data infrastructure that had been developed or was in the process of being developed at the Census Bureau in collaborations with the Social Security Administration in the United States that allowed us to observe where people were born, county of birth, their exact date of birth, and linkages to their contemporary earnings today from, say, employer W-2 forms or other tax-related forms that document their income or earnings, I should say. And so it was that linkage that allowed us to say, okay, well, let's just kind of take this off-the-shelf research design that had been used by researchers and connect it very simply to a different outcome.
Yeah.
And this outcome is going to be an outcome measured 20 to 30 to 40 years later, and then just test using the same research design. What do the outcomes look like? And do they look different? And so I think it's the paper in some ways was quite simple in that regard. And I think that the thing that potentially made the paper interesting, aside from the actual findings and or possible, is just this data that
Yeah.
kind of by happenstance we kind of happened to stumble across in the midst of our own dissertation related research.
Well, it seems you're good at stumbling upon very useful data sources, like same with the offsets and then this one. So, um, if you want to call it that, because it's like just having the eye open. So, could you then also maybe talk about the magnitude that you found of in terms of impact?
Yeah, I mean, I believe this is going back to graduate school is going to date me a little bit, and of course publication lags
Exactly.
after that. So it's been a while since I've seen, but it's just something like between like 200, 300, $400 on average in terms of earnings. So these are the annual earnings of someone who's like at age 30.
Yeah.
Um, and so it basically the children that were born in the periods where air had cleaned up quite dramatically compared to these other cohorts in regions born in the same year, but where air quality hadn't cleaned up as much. The cohorts that were born in these regimes where there was much cleaner air around when they were born have adult earnings that look a little bit higher on
Yeah.
the magnitude of 200, 300, $400 at age 30. And there's a lot more discussion in the paper about other
Yeah.
potential outcomes to measure and other things we could measure and or mechanisms.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that I'll just kind of point out is that I don't think, and I think that the evidence in this paper would suggest as well, that this isn't like an average effect for everybody per se. But what I think is happening is that we're taking um, these are effectively averages over some people that are severely affected and other people who are not affected at all.
Got
And so
it.
the mean comes out to be something like 200, 300, $400. But when you kind of roll that up into the aggregate social cost of, or in this case, maybe the benefits of air pollution improvements, um, in aggregate, these numbers become quite large.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really struck me when reading this is, and I'll even just quote from it. Nevertheless, our estimates suggest that the long run welfare cost of exposure to environmental toxins, as measured by lifetime earnings losses, may be as large or larger than the monetized costs of death based on short run impacts of infant mortality, examined in previous research. And then you cite Shea and Greenstone. So I imagine it's just purely because of the scale of people being exposed to this that it just adds up to just this giant, or like this very that it just adds up to this very sizable, substantial impact.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's true more generally. There's some interesting review work by people like Matt Nidell or Joshua Zivin at thinking about like the non-health cost of environmental externalities, maybe in terms of labor productivity or other outcomes that are not directly, that may be, tied to health, but are not direct health outcomes. And these are kind of typically on the margin, like a little bit smaller effects. But given the scale and the breadth of these impacts on society, when you start kind of rolling these things up and aggregating, they become quite substantial.
Got it. Then maybe as some follow-up questions, just because we mentioned earlier, I mean, you said you kind of stumbled upon this data set also with the offsets. Joe told him you were the one reaching out to him saying, hey, have you heard of offsets? Because to the researcher, like finding the good data set is often, a good chunk of like being able to answer the question. Were there any, was it just really, you just came across of it? You just keep an eye open? Is there anything there that strikes you in terms of the process of finding this data?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't know the answer to that.
This is just for the researchers out there who are like doing their PhD and like,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
or
Okay.
are thinking of doing their PhD because
Absolutely. I'll give you one piece of advice that's a little bit flippant. And I don't know who told me this. It might have been Michael Greenstone, but I don't want to quote him on that. And it's the statement that doing research is easy. You just need to know more about a topic than anyone else. And there's a lot of truth in that. And I think it's also a useful North Star to think about where to make contributions in research. So, for example, it's going to be really hard for me to know more about the returns to schooling or returns to education than David Card. So, I don't think that I can get to the frontier or learn more about that literature than he's going to be able to, than him. On the other hand, like within the space of energy and environmental economics, these are relatively nascent, small literatures. And it's kind of easy to read every single paper on a topic in like a week. And it's pretty easy, if you're stubborn enough, to dive into the institutions and learn a ton about them. And then you start kind of seeing all kinds of questions pop up. So that's one thing, is just like being really hungry and committed to a specific topic or area and learning as much as you can, both on the literature side and the institutional side of things, as to what's out there. The other is thinking about existing work and what's held that work back. Like, what are the big challenges in that space? So, in this fetal origins literature, there had been some papers out there studying these types of questions using registers from like Scandinavian countries. And in the US, there's been some kind of stabs at it using, for example, I believe the PSID or the NLSY, which are fairly small data sets. You could access potentially the administrative versions of these data sets to get kind of place of birth linked to long run outcomes, but they're fairly small in nature. And so that's really, I think, hindered a lot of research in that space. And so then in the context of dissertation work, when we saw this kind of county of birth variable in this data set that was linked to long run outcomes, we're like, wow, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
That could open up a lot of questions that people have been working about. And it's just kind of perfect confluence of, at the time, I was kind of at Columbia people like Doug Almond and Janet Curry were there, kind of
Yeah.
working and developing the frontier of this literature in real time. And so there was a lot of ideas in the air,
Yeah.
just kind of Marshallian externalities, if you want to call them that. And and so I think it was just kind of like a little bit of luck
Yeah.
and circumstantial that allowed
Yeah.
us to stumble upon this.
But I like the notion of combining, the hunger and learning all there is to know, the papers first of all, but also like the institutions. I think that's even
Yeah,
now that's happening in Europe. Yeah, so go ahead. You.
well, I was just going to say that there's this fine line, and I don't know where it exists, but institutional detail is incredibly important, period. And it comes up with like lots of clever ideas that you can get out of focusing on institutions. But the real art, and I haven't figured out, is sometimes you can go so deep in the institutional weeds that your project is no longer interesting to anyone but like one other person.
Yeah.
So the art is kind of figuring out like what part of this institution that you just kind of stumbled on, or the research design that may have come about, is like generally interesting and can maybe transcend the
Yeah.
specific niche area that you happen to find, where you could do compelling, say, causal inference, and that's a little bit more art than brute force, I think.
Cool. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think that was a really good one because it's even now, like I'm now in Europe and just kind of drifted towards labor economics after my PhD in environmental economics. But even now here you've got the EU ETS2 that's being developed, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think it's kind of like you say, these are like nascent technologies, and like even just understanding what they are, the rules, the regulations, their impact. I think it's going to be an area for future research too. So
Absolutely, yeah.
it's just like they're very much on my radar in terms of like just completely new things that are going to change markets. So
Yeah, and I think increasingly you see that just small changes to market design, or just the, what Esther Duflo would call the plumbing
yeah,
of policy, is incredibly important. And just small changes in the way that we design these markets, being it with like price collars, or the ability to bank offsets, or the mechanism for thinking about border adjustment pricing, have enormous implications
yeah,
that we don't know much about, and researchers should try to learn and quantify.
yeah. I even just did a podcast that I released this week, which was on the history of the EUTS with like Jos Delbeke, who's kind of like the co-creator. He's like an economist, and just like to say the amount of institutional detail, but also like the political influence on that detail that you don't always see, exposure. Like, why did this happen? And it just turned out some way because of some pressure or some like they wanted to do with certain things, but they needed to take it step by step.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So maybe as a question then, is there anything else you would like to add to what we've discussed, either on the offsets or the JPE article, something you think would be further useful to for people listening to take away, something we haven't really addressed or emphasized?
No, I just think that research begets research, and it just, all of these projects raise lots of interesting questions for me that didn't necessarily fall into this particular research project. I don't know that like I'm in the business of giving a bunch of research ideas away, but but I think that when people ask me like where do research ideas come from, uh, most recently it's from other research projects.
Yeah,
And I think what I've noticed as an advisor of students over the past 10 years or so is that getting that initial start is the hardest part. And then once you start building an agenda, ideas just start like falling out of the sky a little bit, because of ideas that you had while working deep in the weeds of a specific project. And so maybe that's just a lesson, like a more general lesson, is just like it doesn't have to be perfect at the beginning. Just get started. And the deeper you get into a project, you're just going to learn a bunch. And you're going to learn a bunch about tools. You're going to learn a bunch about research. You're going to learn a bunch about institutions. and then hopefully, not always, but sometimes, lightning strikes in a good way, not in a bad way, and new ideas emerge, and new agendas and frontiers start developing of your own research agenda.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. That's really good. Um, I love that. I think we're gonna probably conclude here. I've got a few more comments, just or maybe I'll just share this now. But I actually remember the time and place when I had my breakthrough PhD idea. I was literally on my way back from like University of Chicago, the library, to home in the snow on the midway when I had the idea. And then when I had the idea, I was like, this is the idea that's gonna get me there. So
That's cool.
literally, like it wasn't an apple on my head, but I literally while I had the idea,
Yeah, yeah.
I realized this is the lightning that strikes. So it's sometimes among a snow
Yeah.
-5 degrees in Chicago, where
It's hard to predict, and I think you got to write it down immediately, or otherwise it
yeah,
just disappears. Yeah.
yeah, I was like sprinting home. I was like, and then the next phase started. But awesome, Reed. So
That's
thank
cool.
you so much, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me, and yeah, look forward to listening and learning.
This is the end of the episode. I'd like to thank you for listening all the way to the end. And if you have any advice on how to improve the podcast or advice on future guests or episodes or ideas, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. Have a great day.